Politics and Ethics, the Moral Dimensions of Power. 1. Introduction. The inescapable intersections of politics and ethics. Politics has always stood at the crossroads of power and morality. From ancient city-states to contemporary global governance, the exercise of political authority involves decisions that shape lives, define rights, and allocate opportunities and burdens. Because political decisions affect entire communities, rather than only private individuals, the moral dimensions of power are neither optional nor abstract. They are central to the legitimacy of governance and to the stability of society. 2. Foundations of political ethics: power, legitimacy, and moral obligation. 2.1. Power, the capacity to shape human possibility. Power is the defining feature of political activity. It is the capacity to shape behavior, alter structures, and influence outcomes. Political power can appear as coercive force, economic leverage, cultural influence, symbolic authority, or institutional control. What makes political power distinct is its public character. It is exercised on behalf of a community and under conditions of collective impact. 2.2. Legitimacy, the moral foundation of authority. Max Weber's insight that power without legitimacy becomes mere domination remains foundational. Legitimacy is the public's moral acceptance of authority. It is grounded not only in legal procedures, but also in expectations of fairness, justice, accountability, and respect for human dignity. When legitimacy deteriorates through corruption, severe inequality, or systematic exclusion, citizens may obey out of fear or habit, but they no longer perceive rulers as morally entitled to govern. In such cases, political systems become fragile, and the gap between formal legality and moral authority widens. 3. The tension between realism and morality in political practice. 3.1. Realism, politics as the struggle for power. Realist thinkers, from Thucydides and Machiavelli to modern theorists, like Hans Morgenthau, argue that politics is governed above all by power. In an international system without a world government, states must prioritize security and survival. Moral language, they contend, often masks strategic interests. However, realism does not completely dismiss ethics. Rather, it warns that moral action, detached from an understanding of power, can be self-defeating. An ethical leader must grasp power relations, rival interests, and structural constraints. Realism alerts us to limits, while ethical theory articulates ideals. Responsible politics requires both. 3.2. The dirty hands problem. Political leaders often encounter situations in which morally troubling actions appear necessary to prevent greater harms. This so-called dirty hands dilemma expresses the tragic dimension of politics, sometimes even well-intentioned. Leaders must choose between competing injustices. 4. Ethical challenges in modern democratic politics. 4.1. Representation, responsibility, and conflicting moral claims. Democratic leaders must navigate diverse and often conflicting public demands. Representing one constituency may harm another. Moreover, short-term electoral pressures may conflict with long-term justice, such as environmental sustainability or intergenerational fairness. 4.2. Corruption, the erosion of public trust and equality. Corruption is one of the clearest violations of political ethics. It includes bribery, fraud, nepotism, and regulatory capture. Beyond financial loss, corruption signals that private gain outweighs public duty, hollowing out the very idea of the common good. When citizens believe everything is corrupt, they withdraw trust from institutions, disengage from participation, or turn to cynical and authoritarian alternatives. Combating corruption is therefore not just a technical task, but a moral imperative for preserving democratic legitimacy. 4.3. Populism, emotional politics, and ethical risks. Populism flourishes by dividing society into the pure people and the corrupt elite. It often emerges from real grievances, economic inequality, cultural alienation, or institutional failure, but frequently responds by undermining checks and balances, attacking independent courts and media, and scapegoating minorities. Ethically, populism is worrisome because it simplifies complex problems, encourages hostility, and weakens respect for pluralism. Ethical politics, by contrast, requires truthfulness, restraint, and recognition of legitimate disagreement. 4.4. The ethics of political communication in the digital age. Digital media transform political communication. Social networks, recommendation algorithms, and targeted advertising enable highly customized messaging, but also create echo chambers and spread misinformation at unprecedented speed. Deepfakes and AI-generated content further erode trust in shared facts. Ethical communication therefore requires transparency about sources, commitment to accuracy, respect for citizens' autonomy, and legal frameworks that protect the public sphere from systematic manipulation. Without these, democratic deliberation deteriorates into propaganda and spectacle. 5. Ethical leadership. The moral virtues of political power. 5.1. Integrity, the foundation of trust. Integrity is the alignment between an official's values, promises, and actions. It is the condition for public trust. When leaders repeatedly lie, hide conflicts of interest, or change principles for convenience, citizens reasonably question not only individuals, but the whole system. Ethical leadership demands honesty, consistency, and willingness to accept responsibility for mistakes. 5.2. Justice, the ethical purpose of politics. Justice concerns the fair distribution of rights, duties, opportunities, and resources. Political institutions should protect basic liberties, prevent arbitrary domination, and correct unjust inequalities where possible. Societies are often morally judged by how they treat the least advantaged, the poor, the disabled, ethnic or religious minorities, migrants, and future generations who cannot yet speak. 5.3. Prudence, ethical judgment under uncertainty. Prudence, phronesis, is the virtue that allows leaders to deliberate well about what ought to be done in complex circumstances. Ethical politics is not rigid rule-following, it requires sensitivity to context, openness to evidence, and careful consideration of long-term consequences. Ideological zeal without prudence can turn even noble ideals into sources of harm. 5.4. Moral courage, acting for justice under pressure. Finally, ethical leadership requires courage, the willingness to defend justice and truth when doing so is costly. Civil rights movements, anti-colonial struggles, anti-corruption reforms, and whistleblowing against abuse of power all illustrate how moral courage can transform political realities. Without courage, ethical insight remains powerless. With courage, it becomes a force for structural change. 6. Ethics in international politics, global power, and responsibility. 6.1. National interest and universal moral duties. States seek security and prosperity for their own populations, yet their actions inevitably affect others. Ethical diplomacy aims to align national interests with broader principles of global justice, refugee protection, humanitarian intervention, fair trade, global health, and climate responsibility. All highlight the tension between sovereignty and universal moral claims. 6.2. Just war theory and the morality of force. War raises the gravest ethical questions. Just war theory proposes criteria for judging when going to war is permissible, and how war must be conducted. Just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, last resort, proportionality, and discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. New technologies, drones, autonomous weapons, cyber operations challenge these criteria and demand renewed ethical reflection. to prevent normalization of indiscriminate or unaccountable violence. 6.3. Human rights and global governance. International institutions seek to protect human rights and prevent atrocities, such as genocide or ethnic cleansing. Enforcement, however, is uneven and often constrained by geopolitical interests. Political ethics insists that states and leaders should not remain indifferent or complicit in gross violations, even when intervention is politically costly. 6.4. Environmental ethics and intergenerational justice. Climate change extends political responsibility across borders and generations. High-emission countries bear special obligations to reduce harm, assist vulnerable populations, and support transitions to sustainable energy. Environmental ethics reframes political power as long-term stewardship of a shared planet, rather than short-term exploitation of resources. Conclusion toward a moral architecture of political power. The moral dimensions of power cannot be separated from political practice. Politics determines who thrives and who suffers, who is recognized and who is ignored, who enjoys protection and who is exposed to harm. Ethical politics, therefore, requires leaders with integrity and courage, institutions that enforce accountability, and citizens who take moral responsibility for the public life they share. In a world marked by rapid change, deep inequalities, and complex crises, the need for ethical governance is greater than ever. Power without morality tends toward tyranny. Morality without power risks remaining a noble but ineffective ideal. The task of political ethics is to bring these together, guiding power toward justice, protecting human dignity, and building a political order rooted in the common good.